December 1942. A crippled B-17F. Flying Fortress limped across occupied France, its engines coughing black smoke, its crew already captured or dead. The bomber, nicknamed Wulfe Hound, was about to make an unexpected landing that would change the course of Luftwaffe intelligence. Within hours, German officers surrounded the downed aircraft, staring in disbelief at the precision of its design, the complexity of its systems, and the sheer industrial confidence behind every rivet. They had seen American bombers before, but never one so complete, so advanced, and so far beyond their expectations. Over the next months, the Wulfe Hound would be painstakingly repaired, repainted in German markings, and flown by elite Luftwaffe test pilots who quickly realized they were examining something extraordinary. Among them was Hans-Werner Lerche, Germany's foremost pilot of captured enemy aircraft, whose reports on the B-17 would quietly shake the Reich's faith in its own engineering. This is the story of how a single American bomber, born in the factories of Seattle, became the most studied and envied aircraft in Nazi Germany. June 10th, 1943, Rechlin Airfield, Mecklenburg. The morning haze hung low over the runway, blurring the outlines of hangars that had seen every prototype the Luftwaffe could conjure from the fevered dreams of its engineers. But today, standing at the edge of the concrete strip, Hans-Werner Lerche felt something entirely different. Before him was not a German design, not a Junkers, not a Dornier, not a Heinkel. What loomed in the dawn light was an American giant. The B-17F Wulfe Hound, captured intact in December of the previous year, now painted with black crosses over fading US insignia, its aluminum skin patched in places where ground crews had repaired bullet holes from its final mission. The airfield was quiet, except for the ticking of cooling engines from a parked Messerschmitt and the distant hum of generators feeding power to the instrument sheds. Lerche stood with his logbook in one hand and gloves in the other, studying the strange machine that had crossed half a world to reach this place. Its shape was unlike anything German engineers would have dared. Boxy, inelegant, heavy. Yet in that heaviness, there was purpose, as if the designers had built it to defy the sky through sheer will. The bomber had landed nearly unscathed after its crew had been forced down in France 6 months earlier. Captured by a Luftwaffe recovery unit, it had been repaired at Merseburg and flown north under escort to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main testing and evaluation center. Since then, dozens of engineers, mechanics, and officers had walked circles around it, marveling and scoffing in equal measure. Some called it crude, others brilliant. It was Lerche's job to decide which. At 33 years old, he had already flown more enemy aircraft than any other pilot in Germany. His logbook listed names that even Allied intelligence would later envy: Spitfire, Hurricane, P-38, B-24, and now the B-17. He approached it not as a trophy but as a specimen, one more puzzle to be solved, one more truth to be extracted from enemy steel. He climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The first thing that struck him was the space. Everything inside a German bomber was compact, efficient, almost claustrophobic. But this cockpit felt like a room. 2 wide seats, heavy control columns, a console spread out like a desk. The instruments glowed softly in the morning light, round, precise, cleanly labeled in English. He could read most of them without translation. Airspeed, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature. Even the oxygen regulators were beautifully machined. American engineers had built a machine for endurance, not just performance. He turned a few switches, feeling the resistance in each toggle. The wiring was color-coded, shielded, and secured in a way that no German manufacturer could afford by 1943. In his later notes, Lerche would write that the B-17 cockpit reminded him less of an aircraft and more of a machine tool. Robust, forgiving, designed for men who needed to think about the mission, not the mechanics. Outside, mechanics rolled a fuel truck toward the plane. The smell of high-octane fuel mixed with morning fog. Lerche adjusted his cap and looked at the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. Each one produced 1,200 horsepower. Together they weighed more than an entire Bf-109. The Americans had built them in thousands, each engine a triumph of standardization. Every bolt was interchangeable, every fitting identical across models. German engines required adjustment, finesse, the touch of a craftsman. These, Lerche realized, required only a wrench and time. He made a note of that too. When he pushed the starter for engine 1, the roar startled the ground crew. It wasn't the snarl of a Daimler Benz, high-pitched and mechanical. It was a deep, steady thunder, smooth, almost comforting. The vibration filled the cockpit floor. He smiled slightly. Whatever else he found today, this was already impressive. At 8:17, he released the brakes. The bomber began to roll, heavy but obedient. The tail rose slowly. Then the main wheels left the runway with a grace that betrayed its bulk. He climbed through the morning haze, the horizon widening as Rechlin shrank beneath him. At 5,000 meters, he leveled off and began his tests. The control response was heavy but stable. He banked left, then right, watching the wings flex slightly but without protest. He recorded airspeed, rate of climb, engine temperature. Every system seemed to work flawlessly. At 6,000 meters, he opened the throttles fully. The superchargers whined faintly as the aircraft surged forward, steady as a freight train. The altimeter needle climbed smoothly past 7,000. In his report, he would write, "The high-altitude handling surpasses anything Germany has built." No German bomber and few of our fighters can match this stability at such height. Below him, the landscape of northern Germany rolled past like a map. Patches of forest, small villages, the silver gleam of a lake. The radio crackled with the ground controller's voice, asking for confirmation of engine readings. Lerche responded in clipped tones, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. The American engineers had not built this bomber for beauty or elegance. They had built it for reliability. Every gauge told him the same story. Redundancy, over-engineering, safety margins far beyond German standards. Each engine had its own fire extinguisher system, each fuel tank self-sealing. Even the oxygen lines were doubled. He realized what that meant. This machine was built for crews expected to live. German bombers were built for crews expected to die gloriously. He tested the defensive systems next. The gun turrets were electrically powered, each with a smoothness that his own engineers would have envied. He turned one manually, noting how the motors hummed without strain. The ammunition feeds were simple and efficient, designed for uninterrupted fire. Later, in his debriefing, he would admit to being shocked at how much thought had been given to the gunner's comfort. Padded seats, heating ducts, and clear sight lines. Even the glass was of superior clarity. It was as if the Americans assumed their gunners would be in battle for hours, not minutes. He found no wasted space, no shortcuts, no evidence of desperation. This was the product of a nation that had the time, materials, and confidence to build for endurance. Back at Rechlin, officers and engineers waited near the hangar as the bomber approached for landing. The twin black crosses under its wings flashed in the sunlight. As it touched down and rolled to a stop, the crowd approached cautiously, as if the machine were a captured beast. Lerche climbed down from the cockpit, face calm, logbook in hand. The senior engineer from Messerschmitt asked him immediately, "Well, how does it fly?" Lerche hesitated before answering. Then, in the measured tone of a man describing an uncomfortable truth, he said, "It flies like a cathedral moves through air, slow to turn, but unshakable once set on course." The engineers laughed uncertainly, unsure whether it was praise or criticism. Lerche did not elaborate. He simply handed over his notes and walked toward the operations hut. That night, under the dim light of a single bulb, he expanded his observations. His handwriting, normally precise and mechanical, grew more fluid as he tried to capture what he had felt. "This machine reflects an industrial philosophy we cannot match," he wrote. "It is not delicate. It is not sophisticated in the German sense, but it is perfect for war. Every part is designed for replacement, not repair. Every system anticipates failure and overcomes it through abundance. Where we economize, they multiply. Where we innovate, they standardize. Where we perfect, they produce." He underlined that last word twice. Produce. The word carried a weight he had not felt before. He knew that somewhere across the ocean, thousands more of these bombers were rolling off assembly lines, identical to this one, ready to replace any that fell. In the following weeks, Lerche flew the Wulfe Hound repeatedly. Each test deepened his respect for the machine. He studied its supercharger system, marveling at its efficiency at high altitude. German engines relied on complex, variable-speed drives that required constant adjustment. The American system was automatic, self-regulating. It maintained power with minimal pilot input, allowing focus on navigation and formation flying. He wrote that this single feature alone gave the Americans an operational advantage. Fatigue was reduced, concentration preserved. He tested the autopilot, finding it more precise than any German equivalent. He tested the bomb bay doors, hydraulically operated, fast, reliable. Even the heating system impressed him. At altitude, the cabin remained tolerably warm, a small miracle for crews used to frost forming on their masks. Engineers from Rechlin and Berlin visited to examine the bomber. Some refused to believe the data. The Luftwaffe's own designs, the He-177 and Ju-188, were plagued with reliability issues. Engines overheated, hydraulic systems failed, structures cracked under stress. Yet this captured B-17, after months of service, continued to operate flawlessly. When technicians disassembled one of its engines for inspection, they found every bearing still within factory tolerance. The metallurgy was impeccable. The crankcases were precision machined, the pistons balanced with a degree of care that seemed industrially impossible. "They build these like we build watches," one engineer muttered. Lerche overheard him and quietly corrected, "No. They build them like we wish we could build watches." The psychological effect on the German testing crews was subtle but profound. Pride had always been their armor. Belief in superior engineering, superior design, superior intellect. But each flight of the Wulfe Hound chipped away at that armor. The realization spread that Germany could not hope to match this level of output. The Allies had quantity, but they also had quality born of organization. Lerche noticed the shift in tone during mess hall conversations. Where once engineers boasted of upcoming prototypes, they now spoke quietly of American capacity. The B-17 had become more than a captured bomber. It was a mirror held up to the Reich's illusions. By late summer, the Luftwaffe's Secret Operations Unit, KG-200, began taking interest in the aircraft. They saw its potential not as a test subject, but as a weapon. Using its familiar silhouette, they proposed employing captured B-17s for infiltration and reconnaissance missions, slipping among Allied formations to gather intelligence or sow confusion. Lerche was ordered to prepare training notes for pilots who would later fly these deceptive missions. He felt uneasy about the idea, but followed orders. In his notes, he included detailed descriptions of Allied radio procedures, formation spacing, and recognition signals, all gleaned from captured manuals. "The greatest danger," he wrote, "is not enemy fire, but error. To mimic the enemy too well is to become him." That sentence lingered with him. To mimic the enemy too well is to become him. Each time he sat in the B-17's cockpit, surrounded by English labels and American instrumentation, he felt that strange dissonance again. The aircraft was German only by circumstance, its heart still American. Even with black crosses on its wings, it carried the scent of another world, one of mass production, confident design, and almost careless abundance. He imagined the factories that had built it, endless rows of women riveting panels, conveyor belts carrying engines, test stands roaring day and night. America was not fighting the war the same way Germany was. It wasn't bleeding itself dry for glory. It was manufacturing victory. Lerche continued his test flights into autumn, recording performance data at various altitudes. Each entry in his logbook became a small act of revelation. At 7,600 meters, all 4 engines still produced full power. The bomber could hold altitude on 3, even 2, without losing stability. The oxygen system kept pressure steady for hours. Even after repeated flights, there were no oil leaks, no structural fatigue, no instrument failures. The engineers began to joke that the only way to ground it would be to run out of fuel. Lerche didn't laugh. He was beginning to understand the larger picture. Each flight confirmed a truth the Luftwaffe had spent years denying. The enemy's strength did not lie only in numbers, but in process. In the ability to build machines that worked flawlessly, endlessly, predictably. In November 1943, the Wulfe Hound was reassigned to KG-200 for operational use. Lerche supervised its transfer, watching as technicians repainted its markings again, this time to mimic Allied serial numbers. The irony was not lost on him. The Luftwaffe was reduced to imitating its enemy's machines because it could no longer produce enough of its own. When he signed the transfer papers, he added one final note to his personal log. "This aircraft, though foreign, may teach us more about ourselves than any victory." He closed the book and walked out into the cold air, the low hum of engines echoing across the field. Years later, after the war, Lerche would look back on those days at Rechlin as the moment his faith in German technological superiority began to waver. He had flown the best his nation could build, and he had flown what the enemy built in thousands. The difference was no longer deniable. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The B-17 was not a marvel of genius, but a triumph of method. Its power lay in the society that produced it, one that valued organization over individuality, teamwork over brilliance, Abundance over austerity. We could design miracles, but they could build them by the tens of thousands. That was the true weapon of democracy. The Wulfe Hound would eventually vanish, its final mission lost to history, perhaps destroyed in an air raid or dismantled for study. But its impact remained. Those who had seen it fly carried away a quiet understanding that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany could still produce innovation, but not continuity. It could build prototypes, but not fleets. The Americans had mastered something far greater than invention. They had mastered repetition. On that final test flight at Rechlin, as the sun dipped below the clouds and the engines droned like distant thunder, Lerche had felt something close to awe. Looking down at the small, dark towns scattered across the countryside, he thought of the endless lights that must be burning across America's factories at that very moment. Assembly lines stretching beyond the horizon, furnaces glowing through the night, thousands of hands working in rhythm. For the first time, he realized that the war could not be won by courage or strategy or even superior machines. It would be won by the nation that could build forever, without exhaustion. As he throttled back for landing, the bomber seemed almost reluctant to descend, as if it knew it belonged to a world that Germany could never create. When he touched down and the wheels met the runway, the vibration carried up through the cockpit floor, steady, sure, alive with purpose. He sat for a moment before shutting down the engines, listening to them wind down into silence. Then he wrote his final note for the day. The Americans have built not an aircraft, but a system. It flies on more than fuel and air. It flies on factories, on electricity, on belief in abundance. We are fighting an enemy whose true weapon is capacity. And with that, Hans-Werner Lerche closed his logbook, unaware that his quiet observation would one day describe the entire war. December 12th, 1942. A grey winter dawn spread across the fields near Melun, France, dusting the hedgerows with frost and illuminating a sight no one expected to see. A massive four-engined bomber sat awkwardly in the stubble of a harvested field, one wing dipped into the soft earth, the other tilted toward the horizon like a wounded bird. The white star of the United States Army Air Forces was still visible on its fuselage, though half of it had been scorched away by heat and oil. Around it, the air smelled of burnt rubber and cordite. The villagers who first arrived kept their distance. To them, it looked like a creature from another world, an American machine that had crossed the war's invisible border and fallen quietly into their farmland. The aircraft was the B-17F Wulfe Hound, serial number 41-24585, part of the 361st Bomb Squadron, 303rd Bomb Group, out of Molesworth, England. The crew had taken off that morning for a mission over Rouen, flying in formation with dozens of other fortresses, their contrails weaving across the sky like white veins. Somewhere near the French coast, flak tore through their right engines. One caught fire, the other lost oil pressure. The pilot, Lieutenant Paul Flickinger, feathered the propeller and tried to maintain altitude. They were too far from the channel, too low to rejoin formation. German fighters appeared, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs diving through the cloud banks. The fortress shuddered under cannon fire. Control cables snapped. Flickinger ordered the bombs jettisoned to lighten the load, but it was too late. He turned the wounded plane westward, hoping to reach the English coast. For 30 minutes they limped on 3 engines, then 2, losing altitude with every mile. The intercom crackled with half-audible prayers. At 5,000 feet, Flickinger ordered the crew to prepare for a forced landing. Through gaps in the clouds, he saw fields near Melun, wide and flat enough to risk it. The landing gear was gone. The hydraulics had bled dry. He dropped the flaps manually and brought the aircraft down on its belly. The impact tore through the frozen soil, scattering earth like shrapnel. When it stopped, silence filled the cabin. No explosions, no fire. Miraculously, all 10 crewmen survived. They burned the maps, destroyed the codes, and tried to run. Within hours, German troops arrived from a nearby garrison. The villagers watched as soldiers surrounded the field, weapons drawn, faces lit by the novelty of what lay before them. An intact American flying fortress, still warm from flight. News traveled fast. By the next morning, Luftwaffe officers from Paris had arrived, followed by technical teams from the Fliegerhorst at Villers-Coublay. Photographs were taken from every angle. Technicians measured propeller blades, recorded serial numbers, traced bullet holes. An officer climbed into the cockpit and whistled softly at the complexity of the instrument panel. The Americans had left little intact inside. Radio codes burned, documents shredded, but the airframe itself was undamaged. The engines could be repaired, the hydraulics replaced. Within days, orders came from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. The aircraft was to be recovered, repaired, and shipped to Germany. The salvage operation began on December the 15th. Local farmers were ordered to assist, their oxen dragging wooden planks under the fuselage as cranes from a nearby rail depot were brought in to lift the massive frame. The Germans gave it a code name, A100, later redesignated DL+XC after the standard captured aircraft registry. They painted over the American insignia and added temporary black crosses on the wings. The engines were removed for transport. By New Year's Day, the entire aircraft had been disassembled and loaded onto rail cars bound for Meersburg, home to one of the Luftwaffe's largest repair depots. At Meersburg, the winter air smelled of oil and burnt coal. Mechanics worked under tarpaulins to protect against snow as they began the painstaking process of rebuilding the bomber. Each section was studied, photographed, and catalogued. The American electrical systems fascinated the engineers. Color-coded wiring, plug-and-play connectors, and modular instrument panels. German aircraft used hand-assembled wiring looms, each unique to the plane. Replacing one meant resoldering an entire circuit. The Americans had designed theirs for rapid replacement. "You could change a complete system in hours," one engineer remarked. "Ours would take days." By February 1943, the aircraft was ready for ground testing. The engines, Wright Cyclone R1820S, had been overhauled using parts scavenged from downed B-17s and some components reverse-engineered in German factories. When the mechanics primed the fuel pumps and hit the starters, the 4 radial engines came to life almost instantly, the exhausts spitting white smoke into the icy air. The ground crew stepped back, watching the massive propellers slice through the mist. The roar was different from anything German, lower, steadier, confident. One technician later recalled that it sounded less like an aircraft and more like a factory moving through air. The first test flight took place in March 1943. The pilot was Hans-Werner Lerche, whose calm precision had already earned him the reputation as the Luftwaffe's most trusted evaluator of foreign aircraft. He had flown Spitfires, P-38s, and captured Soviet Yak fighters, each time producing detailed technical reports that influenced German design improvements. But the Wulfe Hound was something else entirely. It wasn't just another enemy fighter to measure against German standards. It was an entire philosophy of production embodied in metal. When Lerche lifted off from Merseburg that morning, the bomber's shadow rolled across the snow-covered fields like a moving building. At 3,000 meters, he trimmed the controls and began to test responsiveness. The aircraft was heavy on the stick but stable, forgiving, almost serene. At altitude, it felt unshakable, gliding through turbulence that would have rattled any Heinkel. Radioed down to the ground controllers. Maschine reagiert präzise. Keine Vibrationen, keine Drift. Precise response. No vibration, no drift. In his post-flight debriefing, he described the handling as remarkably steady, even graceful for its size. Lerche's notes were forwarded to the Rechlin Test Center, where engineers from Messerschmitt, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf awaited the results. What they learned over the following weeks would unsettle them. The B-17's structural integrity was unlike anything they had seen. Its fuselage frames were heavier, but far stronger. Its rivets were flush-mounted for aerodynamics, yet produced on an industrial scale. The Americans had managed to combine mass production with precision manufacturing, two concepts that, in German thinking, had always existed in opposition. The electrical systems caused particular astonishment. The bomber used an extensive network of circuit breakers, each labeled and accessible. German bombers relied on fuses that often failed under stress. The hydraulic system had built-in redundancies. If one line was damaged, another took over automatically. Even the oxygen regulators were fitted with small pressure gauges for each crew member, something unheard of in Luftwaffe aircraft. These details seemed minor until engineers realized what they represented. A design built around the assumption that every life aboard was worth protecting. By May 1943, the Wulfe Hound had become the most studied aircraft in Germany. Teams from Rechlin rotated through Merseburg to conduct component tests. Metallurgists examined alloy samples, trying to replicate the light yet durable American aluminum blend. Radio technicians disassembled the communication equipment, noting that its clarity surpassed their few G10 systems. The radar altimeter set, standard in the B-17, was a revelation. It gave pilots precise altitude readings even at night or in fog. Germany had similar technology and prototype, but nowhere near such reliability. The Luftwaffe High Command recognized the intelligence value immediately. General Ernst Udet's successors had long argued that the key to victory was technological superiority. Yet here was proof that the Americans had achieved something more dangerous than innovation: standardization on a continental scale. In June 1943, orders were issued to repaint and fully restore the B-17 for demonstration flights. The captured bomber would be shown to senior officers as evidence of Allied industrial capacity. Photographs from that summer show the Wulfe Hound gleaming under the German sun, its polished aluminum skin reflecting the sky. The new markings, black crosses on the wings, the tail code DL plus XC, stood out against the silver fuselage. From a distance, it could still pass for an American aircraft. German propaganda photographers posed beside it, smiling awkwardly, though few of those pictures were ever published. They understood what it symbolized. When the bomber flew again, it carried observers in every compartment. Engineers crowded the radio room. Technicians checked vibration sensors, and officers leaned over Lerche's shoulder as he demonstrated the autopilot. The flights gathered data on fuel consumption, climb rates, and performance curves at various altitudes. The results were consistent. The B-17 maintained power and stability where most German bombers faltered. Its superchargers provided smooth thrust well above 20,000 feet, critical for long-range missions. The He-177, Germany's heavy bomber counterpart, could rarely achieve such altitudes without engine failure or fire. In one particularly revealing test, the Wulfe Hound was loaded to near maximum weight and flown from Merseburg to Rechlin without refueling, a distance of over 300 miles. It arrived with fuel to spare. The American fuel efficiency, even with 4 engines, astonished the technicians. "Their engines waste nothing," wrote one analyst. "They are designed for the long game. We design for performance. They design for endurance." As the months passed, the aircraft became an unofficial classroom for the Luftwaffe's engineers. Students from the Technical University of Berlin were brought to study its systems. The cockpit was left open for demonstrations. Visitors were encouraged to handle the controls, to see how everything fit logically within reach. Even skeptics admitted grudging respect. "It is not elegant," one said, "but it works, always works." In the summer of 1943, as the Allies intensified their bombing campaign over the Reich, the psychological contrast between the captured fortress and the destruction raining down from hundreds of its kind became impossible to ignore. Each night, German cities burned beneath waves of bombers, nearly identical to the one sitting safely in their hangar. Technicians at Merseburg joked bitterly that they could identify the sound of B-17 engines long before the air raid sirens began. The captured Wulfe Hound became a ghost of the enemy, an artifact of the machine that haunted their skies. By August, the Luftwaffe's secret operations wing, Kampfgeschwader 200, requested control of the aircraft. KG 200 specialized in clandestine missions, long-range reconnaissance, infiltration, and deception. Its pilots were trained to operate captured Allied planes, to infiltrate bomber formations, or conduct covert transport. The Wulfe Hound was ideal for such tasks. It could blend seamlessly among American formations, using its original silhouette to move unnoticed until the last moment. Lerche's reports were used to brief KG 200 crews on handling characteristics, flight procedures, and radio protocol. In September 1943, the aircraft was transferred to Finsterwalde Airfield under Heng 200 command. There, its American markings were reapplied with careful accuracy. A white star within a blue circle, false serial numbers, even squadron codes matching those of real American units. Only under close inspection could one notice the subtle differences in paint sheen or stenciling. German technicians learned to mimic the smallest details: English maintenance instructions, crew names stenciled under cockpit windows, even the faint weathering on the fuselage. At Finsterwalde, the Wulfe Hound took on a new role. It was no longer just a study piece. It was an operative tool. KG 200 pilots used it for familiarization flights, learning to approach Allied bomber streams undetected. Its radio equipment allowed them to monitor Allied communications, identifying call signs and frequencies. Occasionally it was flown near the North Sea to test radar signatures. Some accounts suggest it even performed reconnaissance missions, though records remain incomplete. Allied crews later reported seeing fortresses with black crosses briefly joining formations before peeling away. Whether these sightings were of the Wulfe Hound or other captured bombers remains uncertain, but the legend persisted. Technicians kept the aircraft in near-perfect condition through the winter of 1943 to 44. They loved it as much as they feared it. To them, it represented everything the Reich had failed to achieve: reliability, abundance, simplicity. Each maintenance inspection became a small act of admiration. They discovered that components could be replaced interchangeably with those from other captured wrecks, proof of a manufacturing discipline they could only dream of. "You could build 100 of these without deviation," wrote one Luftwaffe mechanic. "We cannot build 10 Heinkels alike." By early 1944, Allied bombing raids had intensified to the point that even Merseburg's factories were under threat. The Wulfe Hound was occasionally relocated to avoid destruction, moving between test sites under heavy guard. Each flight became riskier as the air war turned decisively against Germany. Yet the aircraft continued to function flawlessly, surviving conditions that grounded most German bombers. It was a stubborn survivor, indifferent to the fate of the Reich around it. The Americans had built the Wulfe Hound for mass production, never imagining that it would become a singular treasure in enemy hands. But in Germany, it was treated like a relic, a machine that embodied the future they were already losing. Technicians joked that if the war ended tomorrow, this aircraft alone could serve as the blueprint for rebuilding the Luftwaffe. In April 1944, Allied bombers struck the Finsterwald region. The Wulfe Hound was moved again, this time to Rechlin for safekeeping. It arrived battered from constant use, but still operational. The engineers there continued their evaluations, even as the war closed in. By then, Rechlin itself was within range of Allied raids, and fuel shortages limited further flying. The last known test flight occurred in June 1944. After that, records grow thin. Some reports claim the aircraft was destroyed in a bombing raid later that summer. Others suggest it was deliberately dismantled to prevent capture. What is certain is that it never returned to the skies after the autumn of 1944. Its disappearance became the stuff of speculation among both sides. Allied intelligence, analyzing reports of Black Cross fortresses, concluded that the Germans had operated at least one captured B-17 for infiltration and radio deception. Post-war interrogations confirmed that several such aircraft existed, but none were found intact. The Wulfe Hound's ultimate fate remains unknown, perhaps buried in rubble at Rechlin, perhaps dismantled for scrap as the Reich collapsed. Yet its impact endured. The data gathered from its study influenced German engineering until the war's final days. The Luftwaffe attempted to adapt some of its systems: modular electrical panels, simplified maintenance access, improved crew ergonomics. But by 1944, shortages of materials and manpower made implementation impossible. The lessons arrived too late. For the Americans, the loss of the Wulfe Hound was little more than a footnote in wartime records. Dozens of bombers were lost every week. But for the Germans, its capture provided a glimpse into a world they could not replicate, a world of endless production lines and confident abundance. To study the Wulfe Hound was to confront the reality that Germany's war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factories and foundries of its enemy. After the war, Allied investigators found scattered documents at Rechlin and Merseburg, performance charts, photographs, engine analyses. One folder, marked Geheime Kommandosache, B-17 Versuchsmuster, contained Lerche's final technical report. In it, he summarized 2 years of testing with a single, devastating sentence: "Dieses Flugzeug ist keine Waffe, sondern eine Industrie in der Luft." This aircraft is not a weapon, but an industry in the air. That phrase would later be quoted by historians as the most concise assessment of America's wartime power. The Wulfe Hound had taught its captors a lesson they would not forget. Strength, it turned out, was not a matter of genius or will, but of process. an unending rhythm of production that no ideology could imitate. When the war ended in May 1945, the fields of Melun had long since healed. The furrows where the fortress first slid to a stop were overgrown with grass. Children played there, unaware that the ground beneath them had once held the machine that revealed to Germany the true meaning of industrial war. Somewhere in that field, fragments of aluminum still glinted under the soil, mute reminders of the day a flying fortress fell from the sky and began its second life, as both a trophy and a teacher. And though the Wulfe Hound would never fly again, its legacy endured in every German engineer who had walked its decks, in every pilot who had watched its engine soar on the first try, and in every quiet admission that followed that they had never built anything like it. February 1944. Finsterwalde airfield lay under a shroud of fog so thick that the control tower vanished beyond 20 meters. The air smelled of damp soil and oil, a mixture familiar to every mechanic who had ever worked through the night. In the main hangar, beneath blackout curtains drawn tight, a group of men stood silently around a machine that should not have existed on German soil. It bore American insignia, a white star within a blue circle, painted with the same precision as those seen over the skies of Schweinfurt and Bremen. The stenciling on the fuselage read DFA, and even the chipped paint around the windows looked authentic. Only a trained eye could have noticed the faint edges of the black crosses that had been painted over weeks earlier. This was no ordinary aircraft. It was one of several captured B-17 flying fortresses, rebuilt and refitted for a purpose that only a handful of men in Germany understood. Above the hangar door, a small sign carried 3 letters: KG 200, Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's most secretive unit. To the outside world, KG 200 barely existed. Even within the Luftwaffe, few officers could describe what it did. Its records were sealed under the highest classification, Geheime Kommandosache. Its missions blended espionage, deception, and psychological warfare. The men assigned here were hand-picked, pilots fluent in English, radio operators trained in Allied procedures, engineers skilled enough to keep foreign aircraft alive with limited spare parts. For them, the war was fought not through massed formations, but through illusion. The unit's origins went back to 1942, when Colonel Theodor Rowehl, an early pioneer of aerial reconnaissance, had envisioned a squadron capable of testing and exploiting captured enemy technology. Under his guidance, the Luftwaffe's secret testing groups evolved into operational wings tasked with using that technology in the field. By 1943, as the air war turned decisively against Germany, KG-200's role expanded. It became the invisible hand of the Luftwaffe, testing new weapons, inserting spies, and flying clandestine missions deep behind enemy lines. The captured B-17F, known as the Wulfe Hound, became one of their most prized assets. When it arrived from Merseburg, still gleaming from months of test flights, mechanics at Finsterwalde worked around the clock to restore it to American appearance. Using photographs from downed aircraft, they recreated every marking, even the maintenance notes scrawled in English beside access panels. The authenticity bordered on obsession. The deception had to be flawless. Inside the hangar, Captain Herbert Gessner, one of KG-200's operations officers, inspected the work. He had served as a bomber pilot over England before being reassigned to special operations for his language skills. Now, as he ran his hand along the fuselage, he felt both admiration and unease. "If I didn't know better," he murmured, "I'd think we were in England." The man beside him, Lieutenant Ernst Wenzel, laughed softly. "That's the idea, sir." The plan was simple in theory, but perilous in execution. German command wanted to use the captured fortress for infiltration missions, flying alongside Allied bomber streams, gathering radio intelligence, and occasionally relaying false coordinates. The idea originated from a report by Luftwaffe radar analysts who noticed gaps in Allied formation coverage during long-range missions. A B-17 painted in proper colors could, in theory, slip among them long enough to monitor frequencies and call signs. If detected, the crew would have seconds to disguise their voices over the radio before being blown apart by defensive fire. For weeks, pilots trained in English radio chatter, memorizing slang, call-outs, and even the tone of American crew banter. The Luftwaffe Linguistics School at Oberst supplied phonetic scripts. "Don't sound too perfect," the instructors warned. "Americans speak like they're chewing." The crews practiced until their throats were raw, learning to mimic everything from casual radio exchanges to distress calls. Flight training was equally meticulous. Pilots studied Allied formation tactics, the box formations, the offset spacing, the timing of turns. They learned the rhythms of American escort patrols and the navigation routes used by bomber groups leaving England. Each flight required intimate knowledge of enemy habits, for one misstep would mean destruction. In the second week of March 1944, the Wulfe Hound rolled out for its first deception exercise. Dawn broke over Finsterwald with a pale metallic light as mechanics fueled the bomber. Its engines coughed to life one after another, the deep rumble echoing across the foggy field. From a distance, it could have been an American aircraft starting up at Bassingbourn or Thurley. The crew, 6 men instead of the usual 10, wore flight jackets stripped of insignia. Each carried a cyanide capsule. None expected to return if captured. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, its silhouette melted into the morning haze. For the first hour, it climbed northwest, following a path parallel to Allied bomber routes toward the North Sea. The plan was to test radar detection. German ground stations would track the aircraft as if it were an enemy formation, while the crew monitored how long it could remain unidentified. At 6,000 meters, radio operators switched to Allied frequencies. Static filled their headphones, then came the familiar rhythm of English voices. B-24 crews reporting positions, controllers relaying weather updates. It was like eavesdropping on another world. The operators scribbled down call signs, altitude codes, and frequencies. Everything was transmitted back to a listening post near Bremen. The mission lasted 3 hours. When the Wulfe Hound returned to Finsterwald, it carried pages of intercepted data and a newfound respect for the complexity of Allied communications. Over the following weeks, KG-200 refined its deception tactics. The Wulfe Hound was used to simulate Allied formations, testing German radar recognition systems. It flew mock raids to calibrate flak batteries and train night fighters to identify silhouettes. Each mission deepened the aircrew's knowledge of their enemy and their admiration. They noted how Allied crews maintained tight discipline even under radio silence, how formations held steady for hours across the channel, how damaged bombers were escorted home by their companions. "They operate like a single organism," one report observed. "Our strength lies in the individual pilot, theirs lies in the collective machine." The intelligence value of these flights grew rapidly. KG-200's reconnaissance section began compiling a database of Allied bomber group tactics. The B-17's presence within German lines allowed engineers to test jamming equipment and radar countermeasures directly against authentic systems. They discovered, for instance, that the American Identification Friend, or Foe, IFF, transponder could be imitated by capturing its signal and replaying it, a breakthrough that led to the development of short-lived German mimic devices. But the work was dangerous. The skies over Germany were thick with Allied patrols. On several occasions, the Wulfe Hound narrowly escaped being intercepted by German fighters unaware of its identity. To prevent accidents, KG-200 established secret recognition protocols. Whenever one of its aircraft was airborne, specific ground stations broadcast coded messages on Luftwaffe frequencies warning nearby units. Even so, misunderstandings occurred. In April 1944, a pair of Focke-Wulfs mistook the Wulfe Hound for a genuine enemy bomber near Magdeburg and opened fire, damaging its tail. The pilot, Captain Gessner, barely managed to land at an auxiliary strip. After that, KG-200 issued strict orders. Under no circumstances were regular Luftwaffe units to engage unconfirmed contacts without visual identification. The repairs took weeks. Each bullet hole was patched with American-style aluminum panels, matching the original finish. The mechanics joked that it now looked even more authentic. When it returned to service in May, Allied bombers were striking Berlin almost daily. The air war had become a rolling thunder that never ceased. Germany was being strangled from the sky, and the Wulfe Hound, this single surviving symbol of enemy mastery, flew missions that seemed almost absurd against the magnitude of destruction. Yet they continued, driven by curiosity as much as by duty. One mission in late May carried the aircraft over the North Sea at dusk. Its purpose was to shadow an incoming Allied bomber stream and record radar reflections for analysis. The crew used the same radio frequencies as the Americans, listening as voices filled the air around them. Through gaps in the clouds, they saw hundreds of B-17 glinting in the setting sun, stretching across the horizon like a metallic river. For a few moments, the Wulfe Hound slipped among them unnoticed, its engines humming in synchrony with its twins. The illusion was complete. Inside the cockpit, the radio operator whispered, "They'll never know." But they did. Moments later, a call crackled through the radio. "Unidentified fortress, position grid Delta 7, fall out of formation." The crew froze. Someone had spotted the subtle differences, the painted-over serials perhaps, or the missing group insignia. A P-47 Thunderbolt escort broke formation and swung toward them, guns flashing in the fading light. The German pilot pushed the throttles forward and dove into cloud cover, diving so sharply that frost formed on the windscreen. When they emerged over the coast, the fighter was gone. They limped home in silence, shaken but alive. After that, infiltration missions were reduced. The risk was too great. Instead, the B-17s of KG-200 were used primarily for reconnaissance and training. They tested new radar systems, calibrated ground tracking, and trained German crews in identifying Allied bomber formations. Each mission added to a growing archive of technical data that would outlive the aircraft themselves. By summer 1944, KG-200 operated a collection of captured aircraft that astonished even Allied intelligence after the war. Alongside the B-17s were B-24 Liberators, P-51 Mustangs, and even Soviet Yak fighters. Each was maintained in flying condition, used for deception and experimentation. The unit's base network stretched across Germany, from Finsterwalde to Frankfurt, from Oranienburg to Stuttgart. Crews rotated constantly, their identities hidden behind false names. In July, the Wulfe Hound was transferred again, this time to Oranienburg, closer to Berlin. Its engines were nearing the end of their service life, and fuel was scarce. Still, the aircraft remained operational for experimental work. Engineers installed jamming transmitters to test interference with Allied radar navigation. They discovered that by broadcasting on specific frequencies, they could distort pathfinder signals used by bombers at night. For several raids that summer, KG-200 aircraft flew parallel to Allied streams, jamming signals and confusing navigators. Post-mission reports from British crews mentioned phantom beacons and sudden course deviations, small victories in a losing war. Yet the men of KG-200 knew the truth. These acts were no longer changing the outcome. They were delaying the inevitable. Each night, as air raid sirens wailed and cities burned, the sound of B-17 engines filled the darkness. They were the same engines the Germans heard when they started their own captured bomber in daylight. The irony was crushing. By September, the Allies had crossed into France, and fuel shortages crippled operations. The Wulfe Hound was grounded more often than it flew. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecks to keep it alive. They used captured fuel stocks when possible, mixing American high-octane with German additives that fouled the plugs. Still, the engines started faithfully, their rhythm steady as ever. "She doesn't want to die," one mechanic said. "She's an American. She thinks there's always more fuel." In October 1944, the aircraft made one of its final recorded flights. Its mission was to deliver a small reconnaissance team to Norway, where radar installations along the coast monitored Allied convoy movements. The flight was long and dangerous, crossing occupied Denmark at night. When it landed at Trondheim after 8 hours in the air, the ground crew stood in awe. They hadn't seen an intact 4-engine aircraft in months. Most of the Luftwaffe's heavy bombers were grounded, destroyed, or starving for fuel. The Wulfe Hound seemed indestructible. After that mission, records grow uncertain. Some say it returned to Germany and was destroyed during a raid on Oranienburg in November. Others claim it was hidden in a hangar and abandoned at war's end, its engines removed by surrendering troops. What remains undisputed is that by early 1945, the aircraft was gone. KG-200 itself was fragmenting, its surviving crews ordered to destroy documents and disappear. When American investigators entered Finsterwald after the war, they found fragments of evidence, burned logbooks. Half-melted data reels, a few black and white photographs of the Wulfe Hound in flight, with German officers posing proudly beneath its wings. From these remnants, historians later reconstructed the story of KG-200's extraordinary operations. The captured bombers had flown dozens of missions, most unrecorded, many unacknowledged. Their existence blurred the line between spycraft and air warfare. In post-war interrogations, former KG-200 officers described their strange, dual existence. "We lived between two worlds," one pilot said. "We flew American aircraft from German fields, spoke English over the radio, used their procedures, their instruments, even their superstitions. Sometimes I forgot which side I belonged to." Another recalled how, during an infiltration mission, he caught himself humming the tune of Chattanooga Choo Choo, a song he'd heard on Allied broadcasts. "It felt wrong," he said, "but in that cockpit, surrounded by their words and their switches, you began to think like them." Their testimonies revealed something deeper than espionage. The Wulfe Hound and the men who flew it became symbols of a quiet psychological defeat. The Luftwaffe's most secret unit had been reduced to studying and imitating its enemy, acknowledging through every flight that German ingenuity could no longer match American production. The very act of deception required admiration. They copied what they could not surpass. After the war, Allied intelligence analyzed captured documents from KG-200. One report from British investigators summarized the unit's operations with reluctant respect. The Germans employed captured Allied aircraft with exceptional technical competence and daring. Their understanding of Allied communications and tactics was formidable. Nevertheless, their efforts reveal the extent of Germany's decline. They sought victory through imitation, not innovation. In a storage depot outside Paris, American officers examined pieces of the Wulfe Hound's wreckage recovered from a hangar near Oranienburg. A single engine cowling bore traces of both insignias, faded American stars and faint German crosses, overlapping like layers of history. One officer reportedly said, "This is the whole war in one piece of metal." He wasn't wrong. The story of the Wulfe Hound and KG-200 embodied the collision of two worlds, one built on discipline and precision, the other on abundance and relentless production. The Germans had captured a single machine, but in doing so they had glimpsed an industrial civilization so vast that imitation was their only response. Every flight the Wulfe Hound made under KG-200 carried that contradiction through the clouds. A German crew inside an American machine, fighting a war already lost to the factories that had built it. When the ruins of KG-200 were uncovered, investigators found a note scribbled in a pilot's logbook. The handwriting was faint, but the words survived. "We flew as Americans because we could no longer fly as Germans." It was the perfect epitaph for a unit that had mastered deception but could not escape truth. The B-17s of KG-200 vanished into the wreckage of the Reich, but their story remained, a story of imitation born from awe, of enemies who understood too late that industrial strength was the true measure of war. Somewhere in the fog above Finsterwalde, on those early mornings when the engines first came alive, the sound of that captured fortress had carried a message that no one could quite put into words, that Germany's greatest pilots were flying inside their enemy's future. March 3rd, 1931. The sun had not yet risen over Berlin-Tempelhof when a civilian pilot named Theodor Rowehl eased open the throttle of his small Heinkel monoplane and lifted into the cold dawn. There were no markings on the wings, no official observers, no insignia of any kind, only a sealed envelope in his pocket and a pair of high-resolution Zeiss cameras bolted discreetly beneath the fuselage. He climbed to 12,000 feet, turned west, and aimed his lens not at Germany, but across the Polish border. What he photographed that morning, rail junctions, hangars, new airfields, would change the course of German military intelligence forever. The Reichswehr, still shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, had been blind since 1919. Rowehl's illegal flight, conducted under the cover of civilian mapping, gave them eyes again. At that moment, he was not yet an Oberst or even an officer. He was a civilian with a talent for flying and an instinct for secrecy. Born in 1892 near Breslau, Rowehl had served as an observer pilot in the First World War, earning a reputation for meticulous navigation and a near photographic memory. The collapse of the Kaiser's air service left him grounded, working as a flight instructor and cartographer. But the sight of a modern airfield rising beyond Germany's eastern frontier haunted him. The world was rearming while his nation pretended peace. His unauthorized reconnaissance photographs reached a small circle of officers within the Reichswehr ministry, who immediately grasped their value. Within weeks, Rowehl was quietly recruited, his civilian mapping flights repurposed for intelligence gathering. By 1933, with the Nazi regime openly defying Versailles, Rowehl's private venture had evolved into an official organization. He was commissioned as a reserve officer and placed in charge of what would become the Höhenbildzug Rowehl, the Rowehl High-Altitude Photographic Unit. Operating under civilian cover, his pilots flew modified Heinkel and Junkers aircraft across Europe, mapping foreign airfields, industrial zones, and coastal defenses. Their photographs, taken with cameras capable of resolving details less than half a meter wide, formed the backbone of German pre-war intelligence. Long before the Luftwaffe had bombers, it had Rowehl's images. When the Luftwaffe was formally created in 1935, Rowehl's unit was absorbed into its structure as the Aufklärungsgruppe Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, or AGR OBDL. Now an Oberstleutnant, Rowehl answered directly to Hermann Göring. It was an uneasy relationship. Göring, ever the showman, prized flamboyance and loyalty. Rowehl prized precision and silence. His staff referred to him as the Phantom Colonel. He rarely spoke above a whisper, never smiled in photographs, and maintained an office so austere that subordinates joked he could disappear into it. Yet his influence was immense. He built the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance architecture from nothing, training officers, designing cameras, and developing the first specialized high-altitude aircraft. His guiding principle was simple. To control the skies, one must first understand them. By the time war broke out in September 1939, Rowehl's organization had mapped every major European city, from Warsaw to London. His aircraft, flying under weather cover, photographed ports, shipyards, and troop concentrations with stunning clarity. When German forces invaded Poland, their maps already contained detailed annotations prepared from Rowehl's films. In the early months of the war, he operated with near impunity. British defenses were still uncoordinated, and high-altitude flights at 30,000 feet went largely undetected. The intelligence he provided guided bombing raids, submarine patrols, and even diplomatic negotiations. But by 1941, as the war widened, Rowehl's focus shifted from photographing the enemy to understanding his machines. Captured aircraft began arriving at Luftwaffe test centers, wrecks from Norway, France, and the Soviet Union, each representing a small window into foreign design philosophy. Göring ordered systematic study of these machines, and Rowehl, by then a full Oberst, was tasked with creating the protocols. His reconnaissance experience, meticulous documentation, photographic analysis, and technical cross-comparison became the template for evaluating captured aircraft. Under his direction, the Rechlin test facility was reorganized into specialized departments: structural analysis, flight testing, power plant evaluation, and radio systems. Every foreign aircraft was to be photographed in detail, its components measured, its performance charted, and its engineering dissected with the same precision once applied to enemy cities. In April 1941, Rowehl toured Rechlin personally. He arrived without entourage, carrying a briefcase filled with aerial photographs and a worn leather notebook. The engineers were accustomed to flashy visits from generals demanding results. Rowehl, by contrast, asked questions quietly and wrote everything down. he inspected the test hangars, where a captured Spitfire Mark I was being reassembled, and made a single remark that would define the program. "Do not fly it until you can rebuild it." To him, a captured aircraft was not merely an enemy weapon, it was a library of information. His procedures mandated photographic documentation of every stage of restoration, chemical analysis of alloys, and detailed sketches of wiring and fuel systems. These files, organized in grey binders labeled Beuteflugzeugakten, captured aircraft records, would eventually fill entire rooms. Rowehl's methods reflected his reconnaissance background. He believed that understanding came from observation, not speculation. "The photograph does not lie," he often said, "but the observer must learn to see truth within it." At Rechlin, he applied that philosophy to machines. Each test flight was accompanied by still photography and film documentation, allowing engineers to study control surface movements and exhaust patterns. His insistence on visual evidence set the standard for the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Division, later known as Abteilung 5. By 1942, as the war turned increasingly against Germany, the importance of captured aircraft grew. Allied bombers now struck deep into the Reich, and understanding their capabilities became a matter of survival. When the first intact B-17 flying fortress, later named Wulfe Hound, arrived in Germany after its forced landing in France, it was Rowehl who established the evaluation protocol. He ordered that the aircraft be treated as both specimen and teacher, photographed in its damaged state, repaired under supervision, then flown under controlled conditions. Every test, from engine run-up to flight endurance, had to be filmed and logged. The resulting data would be compared against Allied bombing reports to estimate performance margins. In correspondence with his Rechlin staff, dated February 1943, he wrote, "This aircraft represents not only the enemy's weapon, but his industrial mind. Our duty is to measure both." He understood that technology was not isolated from the society that produced it. To Rowehl, the B-17 was less a triumph of aerodynamics than a manifestation of American mass production. His analysts confirmed it: identical rivet patterns across panels, interchangeable components, standardized fittings. He noted with clinical admiration that the Americans built their bombers with the same philosophy the Germans reserved for artillery shells: uniformity, speed, replaceability. Rowehl's analytical rigor impressed even his skeptics. One Rechlin engineer recalled that after the first test flight of the Wulfe Hound, Rowehl ordered every subsystem diagrammed to scale. "He spent hours tracing hydraulic lines on paper," the engineer said, "as if the drawing itself would reveal the secret." In a sense, it did. The documentation uncovered patterns in design, redundant systems, ergonomic layouts, maintenance accessibility, that highlighted the philosophical divide between German and American engineering. Where the Germans sought elegance, the Americans sought reliability. Rowehl's subsequent report to Goering warned that the Luftwaffe could not match such production methods without reorganizing its entire industrial base. Goering ignored the recommendation. Despite his rank, Rowehl never became a political insider. He distrusted the party hierarchy and avoided public appearances. His staff noticed that his uniform bore no Nazi party badge, only the iron-grey wings of the Luftwaffe. His loyalty was to method, not ideology. That independence made him valuable and vulnerable. By late 1943, Goering's circle viewed him with suspicion, particularly after several reports critical of German bomber reliability circulated under his name. He was accused indirectly of defeatism. In truth, he was simply honest. A nation at war cannot afford self-deception. he wrote in a memorandum. "The camera records what the eye denies." The camera again became his weapon. As Allied raids intensified, Rowehl's reconnaissance groups continued flying high-altitude missions even over the British Isles, documenting bomb damage patterns to understand Allied targeting philosophy. He compared those images with photographs of American aircraft interiors taken at Rechlin, correlating design with doctrine. The results were startling. American bombers carried advanced Norden bomb sights capable of precision attacks from 20,000 feet, technology far beyond the Luftwaffe's equivalent. His analysts concluded that accuracy, combined with numbers, would eventually overwhelm German defenses. He forwarded this assessment to the Air Ministry with a note. The enemy's advantage lies not only in his machines, but in his organization of thought. By early 1944, as Germany's situation deteriorated, Rowehl's department found itself fighting a war of data against chaos. Fuel shortages limited test flights. Air raids destroyed archives. He ordered duplicates of every captured aircraft file stored in underground vaults near Ohrdruf. "Knowledge must survive defeat," he told his staff. When the second captured B-17 arrived, damaged but repairable, he was already preparing standardized forms for comparison. His methodical approach transformed chaos into record. Even as bombs fell on Rechlin, technicians continued photographing instruments and transcribing American maintenance manuals. That same year, he authorized the transfer of certain aircraft, including the Wulfe Hound, to KG-200. His rationale was pragmatic. The bomber's intelligence value as a test article had been exhausted. Now it could serve operational purposes. Yet he insisted that all modifications be documented and that flight crews file detailed post-mission reports. Those records, many later destroyed, became the basis for understanding KG-200's clandestine use of captured planes. In one surviving memo, he wrote, "Deception must never outrun comprehension. Each mission is an experiment." As the Reich collapsed, Rowehl's influence waned. Younger officers sought quick solutions: jet fighters, miracle weapons, last-minute innovations. He continued advocating analysis over improvisation. "No weapon wins twice if not understood once," he told a frustrated subordinate. His obsession with documentation seemed almost anachronistic in a world of desperation. Yet his discipline endured. When Allied forces overran Rechlin in April 1945, they found hundreds of crates of negatives, diagrams, and blueprints, all labeled, indexed, and cross-referenced in Rowehl's precise handwriting. In the final weeks of the war, he retreated to his home near Hamburg, burning personal papers but leaving professional files intact. Interrogated by British intelligence in 1946, he explained his work without defensiveness. "I am not a scientist," he told them. "I am an observer. I photographed truth." When asked about the B-17 program, he described it as the culmination of everything he had tried to teach the Luftwaffe. Systematic observation leading to understanding. "We learned more from that one aircraft," he said, "than from 10 years of our own propaganda." Post-war analysts recognized the significance of his contributions. American intelligence officers reviewing the captured archives at Wright Field found detailed analyses of their own aircraft, so accurate that they seemed written by Boeing engineers. One report on the B-17's oxygen system matched factory specifications within decimal points. Another, describing the supercharger assembly, included cutaway drawings labeled in English, copied meticulously from the original manuals. The precision was unmistakably Rowehl's. In 1948, declassified Allied assessments credited him with creating the most advanced aerial reconnaissance and technical intelligence system of any Axis power. His work laid the foundation for post-war military intelligence in both Germany and the emerging NATO alliance. Several of his former subordinates went on to assist Western powers in Cold War reconnaissance projects, applying the same principles he had taught at Rechlin. Photograph, analyze, compare, understand. But Rowehl himself faded into obscurity. He refused offers to work for either East or West Germany, retreating instead to a small apartment in Bad Nauheim. There, he wrote quietly for scientific journals under pseudonyms, publishing articles on photographic optics and atmospheric haze. Neighbors described him as polite, reclusive, always carrying a camera, but never taking pictures of people. When asked about the war, he would simply say, "I learned how much a photograph can reveal, and how little it can change." He died in 1978, largely forgotten outside of specialist circles. Yet his legacy lived on in the methods that defined modern intelligence gathering. Every aerial reconnaissance mission that photographed a missile silo, every satellite that mapped terrain from orbit, owed something to the man who once flew across Poland with a camera hidden under his seat. His philosophy, that observation precedes understanding, remained the quiet thread connecting those who sought truth above ideology. Historians later drew a straight line from his early flights to the systematic evaluation of captured technology that characterized both Allied and Soviet post-war programs. When American teams scoured German laboratories in 1945, they were unknowingly following procedures he had written years earlier. Document, disassemble, compare, replicate. The Rowehl method. The same logic guided the examination of V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, and radar systems. For the men who had worked under him at Rechlin, his influence was more personal. One recalled visiting him in 1943 after a bombing raid had destroyed a hangar full of test aircraft. Rowehl stood amid the wreckage, unshaken. "The machines are gone," he said, "but their photographs remain. We can rebuild the knowledge." That calm faith in documentation as permanence outlived the Reich itself. Looking back, his career formed a paradox. The man who built the Luftwaffe's eyes ended up watching its blindness. His reconnaissance had revealed the truth of enemy strength, yet that very truth was ignored by those who demanded faith over fact. The systematic study of the B-17, which he helped create, demonstrated that Germany's industrial base could never compete with America's scale. It was not a defeat of courage or skill, but of arithmetic. Rowehl saw it clearly and recorded it faithfully. When his notes on the Wulfe Hound were rediscovered decades later in a West German archive, a single line caught the attention of historians. In his careful handwriting, underlined twice, he had written, "Der Krieg der Zukunft wird durch die beobachten, gewonnen." The war of the future will be won by those who observe. He had been right. The age of observation had begun long before the bombs stopped falling, when a solitary pilot lifted off from a Berlin airfield and pointed his camera beyond the horizon. From that moment on, every conflict would depend not only on strength, but on sight, on men like Theodor Rowehl, who believed that truth, once photographed, could never be fully hidden. December 23rd, 1944. The sky over Western Germany hung heavy with cloud and smoke, the kind that blurred the difference between dawn and dusk. Captain Thomas Lerche of the 398th Bomb Group had been flying combat since the summer, long enough to know the look of every ship in his formation by silhouette alone. The B-17s stretched ahead of him in perfect columns of 4, contrails curling like white scars against the grey. 90 minutes into the return from Koblenz, he noticed the newcomer. One more fortress easing into position just outside the high squadron. The shape was right, the gate perfect, the 4 cyclones humming in familiar rhythm. Yet something about it unsettled him. The paint looked too light, almost bare metal, where others were olive drab. Its tail number was partially obscured, its radio strangely silent. He squinted through the canopy and saw, or thought he saw, something painted over the star and bar on the wing, a smudge darker than it should be. Then the dorsal turret turned toward him. Lerche rolled hard left without thinking. His co-pilot shouted as tracers whipped across the air between them, orange streaks dissolving into the clouds. The stranger banked once, leveled, and disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing but silence and a lingering disbelief. Back at Nuthampstead, the debriefing officer listened with an expression of practiced neutrality as Lerche described what he had seen. A fortress with black crosses. The officer wrote, "Possible misidentification" in the margin and moved on. There were rumors already. Enemy aircraft mimicking American bombers, ghost fortresses slipping into formations. It sounded like nonsense until the reports began multiplying. By late 1944, Allied intelligence realized that something extraordinary was happening. German pilots were flying captured B-17. The first rumors surfaced in September, filtering through mess halls and operations tents. Crews returning from missions over Germany claimed they had seen friendly bombers acting strangely, lagging behind, flying without recognition lights, or had signaling in odd patterns. One crew from the 305th swore they had been paced for nearly 10 minutes by a fortress with an unfamiliar tail code before it abruptly turned east. The crew chief remembered the insignia being darker, almost black against the wings. The claims were logged, dismissed, and quietly forgotten until the winter. The confirmation came through an unlikely source. Ground photographs. Aerial reconnaissance over Finsterwald revealed a row of bombers parked along a dispersal line. Most were Fokker-Wulfes and Dorniers, but one stood out. Its wings were straight-edged, its tull unmistakable. Analysts at RAF Medmenham compared the image to known Allied aircraft silhouettes. The verdict was immediate. Boeing B-17, late F or early G model, parked alongside German types. The photo was date-stamped October 1944. Intelligence officers were initially skeptical. They assumed the Germans were studying a wreck. But further photographs taken weeks later showed the same aircraft in a different position, engine cowlings removed, mechanics working beneath its wings. It was alive. Then came the radio intercepts. RAF listening posts in the Netherlands picked up short bursts of English-language transmissions on frequencies normally reserved for American bomber formations. The voices sounded authentic, Midwestern accents, clipped military diction. But the call signs were wrong, subtle deviations that didn't appear on any roster. The transmissions were brief, no more than a few seconds, and always ended abruptly. Analysts suspected spoofing, but the possibility of enemy aircraft transmitting in fluent English was deeply troubling. By December, the phenomenon had a name among bomber crews: false forts. Within the 8th Air Force, confusion turned to alarm. Crews were told to verify visual identification of all aircraft within formation. Tail markings, squadron letters, and call and response authentication codes were emphasized at briefings. A secret bulletin circulated through base intelligence offices warned that enemy-operated B-17 and B-24 aircraft have been observed attempting to infiltrate friendly formations. The document, labeled 8th Air Force Operations Bulletin 1875, urged vigilance but offered few details. Only a handful of officers knew the full story. The roots of the deception traced back to the captured B-17F, known as Wulfe Hound, the same aircraft that had forced-landed in France 2 years earlier and been meticulously restored under Luftwaffe supervision. After exhaustive testing at Rechlin, it had been transferred to the shadowy Kampfgeschwader 200, KG-200, a special operations wing responsible for clandestine missions, reconnaissance, and captured aircraft evaluation. The group's existence was barely understood, even within the German High Command. To most Luftwaffe officers, it was a rumor, a whispered reference to the Black Air Wing. In 1943, when the Wulfe Hound first flew under German control, it served primarily as a test platform. But as the war situation deteriorated, desperation bred imagination. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch conceived a new use for the captured bomber: infiltration. A handful of English-speaking pilots were selected from flight test units and given specialized training. They memorized American radio procedures, studied combat footage, and practiced formation flying to match the spacing and altitude patterns of U.S. bomber groups. Using authentic uniforms from captured airmen and American-made headsets, they could blend in visually and audibly. The plan was simple but dangerous. Disguised fortresses would approach Allied formations from below or from the rear, signal in standard procedure code, and take position within the outer elements. Once accepted as friendly, they would gather information, formation routes, timing, defensive patterns, or transmit false instructions. Occasionally, they were used to broadcast diversionary signals, imitating recall orders or false bombing coordinates. Few missions succeeded fully, but even limited success unsettled Allied command. The Luftwaffe's capacity for mimicry revealed not only technical audacity, but psychological warfare at its most subtle. The first documented Allied encounter occurred on November 27, 1944, during a raid on Misburg. Lieutenant James Walker of the 452nd Bomb Group recalled seeing a B-17 sliding into the low left formation without recognition signals. He was flying tight, real professional, Walker wrote later. But his tail number didn't check. I called him on the radio, asked for his call sign. No reply. Then his ball turret flashed, and I realized the guns were German MGs. He broke off before we could fire. The after-action report noted the anomaly, but classified it as unconfirmed enemy use of friendly aircraft. Weeks later, another incident over Kassel confirmed it beyond doubt. A P-51 escort from the 357th Fighter Group intercepted what appeared to be a straggling fortress. When challenged to flash identification lights, the bomber instead opened fire with nose guns. The Mustang pilot, Captain Harold Brown, returned fire, damaging the enemy's No. 3 engine. The bomber descended in flames, crashing near Hanover. Photographs of the wreck stunned investigators. Beneath the scorched fuselage, barely visible under soot, were black crosses. Inside the wreck, intelligence officers found Luftwaffe-issue oxygen masks, maps marked with Allied air routes, and manuals printed in both English and German. One notebook, recovered from the cockpit, contained meticulous notes on American formation tactics and radio codes. It was signed Oberleutnant Kurt Schäfer, KG 200. By January 1945, Allied intelligence understood that the Luftwaffe's deception flights were not isolated experiments. Interrogations of captured German airmen confirmed that at least all operational B-17 and 2 B-24s had been refitted for infiltration under KG-200's command. Their missions ranged from reconnaissance to psychological warfare, broadcasting on open channels to sow confusion among bomber groups. One pilot, taken prisoner after bailing out of a damaged aircraft, claimed that the goal was not destruction, but disruption. "If we could make your crews doubt their own," he said, "we had already won something." Allied command responded swiftly. Recognition procedures were tightened. Crews were instructed to verify any aircraft joining formation by visual inspection of tail codes and to challenge unknown voices on the intercom. The RAF introduced special password systems that changed daily. Still, the anxiety lingered. Veteran airmen spoke of phantom fortresses appearing suddenly at altitude, their markings indistinct, their formation flying too perfect to be coincidence. For intelligence officers, the discovery carried deeper implications. It revealed how thoroughly the Germans had studied American engineering. Examination of captured wrecks showed that German mechanics had mastered maintenance of the Wright Cyclone engines and even fabricated compatible replacement parts. Some aircraft carried hybrid instrumentation, metric gauges installed beside American dials, German radio sets wired into US circuits. The precision of the conversions impressed Allied investigators as much as it disturbed them. It was proof that the enemy not only understood their machines, but could imitate them convincingly. By February 1945, the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, USSTAF, compiled a detailed intelligence summary titled Enemy Employment of Captured Allied Aircraft. The report, circulated among senior officers, concluded that German-operated bombers had conducted limited but effective operations utilizing deception and psychological exploitation. It recommended continuous vigilance and standardized challenge codes to prevent infiltration. The document also acknowledged the ingenuity of the program, noting that enemy technical mastery of the B-17 type is of a high order. The discovery reshaped Allied attitudes toward technical security. Crews were reminded never to discuss formation patterns over open radio channels and to destroy navigation materials before capture. Aircraft identification procedures were rewritten to emphasize subtle differences: the shape of tail fins, the spacing of formation lights, the reflection of paint under sunlight. The war in the air had entered a new, uneasy phase, where even a familiar shape could no longer be trusted. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence hunted for the base of operations. Reconnaissance flights over central Germany focused on airfields known for experimental activity: Rechlin, Oranienburg, and Finsterwalde. In late February, photo analysts spotted a small cluster of heavy bombers near Oranienburg, some bearing irregular camouflage patterns. The surrounding area showed signs of heavy security: fence lines, guard posts, camouflaged hangars. Analysts labeled the site Special Detachment. Later testimonies from captured Luftwaffe personnel confirmed that it was indeed the main base of KG-200's captured aircraft unit. When American ground forces advanced into the region in April 1945, they found the remnants. One B-17 lay half buried in mud near the airfield perimeter, its nose painted with the remnants of a black cross. Inside, the instrument panels bore German language labels, and the radio compartment still contained a functioning Lorenz transmitter tuned to Allied frequencies. Technical teams photographed every inch of the wreck, before dismantling it for shipment to England. The discovery confirmed beyond question that the Luftwaffe had flown fortresses under their own colors. In the weeks that followed, interrogations of captured KG-200 officers provided a clearer picture of the operation's scope. At its height, the unit maintained 4 flyable B-17s, 2 early F models, 1 G, and a hybrid assembled from wreckage. They were used primarily for reconnaissance, pathfinding, and deception during critical phases of the air war. Missions were often suicidal. Allied air superiority made even approach flights deadly, and most crews never returned. But the information they gathered, formation routes, weather conditions, and response times, was invaluable to German air defense. The psychological effect on Allied crews proved equally significant. Rumors of enemy fortresses spread quickly, feeding the superstitions already common among bomber crews. Men spoke of ghost planes appearing out of cloud banks, of friendly aircraft that opened fire without warning. Some believed the Germans were painting crosses on their own damaged bombers to frighten them. In truth, the Luftwaffe had found a way to weaponize doubt. For Allied intelligence, the story ended where it began, with photographs. In May 1945, after Germany's surrender, RAF investigators entered the captured archives of the Luftwaffe's test command at Rechlin. Among the files was a folder labeled Beuteflugzeuge, B-17. Inside were dozens of prints showing American bombers in German service. Some bore black crosses hastily painted over US stars. Others carried Luftwaffe serial numbers, stenciled neatly along the fuselage. There were engineering notes, maintenance records, and flight logs signed by German test pilots. One entry, dated October 3, 1944, listed a mission under code name Unternehmen Lena. The objective, infiltrate formation of 3rd Air Division for radio observation. The logbook ended abruptly 2 weeks later. The final entry read, aircraft lost, cause unknown. When historians later examined the documents, they concluded that only a handful of such missions had ever succeeded. Yet their impact on morale was disproportionate. Every rumor, every uncertain shadow on the horizon forced aircrews to question what they saw. It was a rare moment when the mechanical precision of the air war gave way to something human. Fear of the familiar turned hostile. In post-war interviews, former KG-200 members described their operations with a mixture of pride and resignation. One pilot, interviewed in 1951, reflected on the paradox of flying the enemy's aircraft. We admired the B-17. It was solid, forgiving, built with logic. To fly it was to understand why we would lose the war. You could feel in its structure the power of the factories that made it. We were borrowing strength we could not match. American investigators who studied the captured wrecks came to similar conclusions. Reports from Wright Field in Ohio described the workmanship of the modified B-17s as remarkably competent. The Germans had maintained the engines meticulously, even improving access panels and fuel system layouts. But the true revelation lay in the philosophy. The Germans had tried to imitate American abundance with ingenuity, and failed only because imitation could not replace scale. In the end, the false fortresses became symbols of the Luftwaffe's final desperation: brilliance without resources, courage without hope. The men who flew them understood that each mission was likely a one-way flight, yet they took off anyway, navigating by moonlight through hostile skies, pretending to belong among enemies who outnumbered them 100 to 1. When the war ended, the surviving aircraft were hauled to Allied test sites for examination. The black crosses were scrubbed away, the stars repainted. For a brief time, they flew again under American markings, test beds for engineers who studied the subtle fingerprints of German modification. Then one by one, they were scrapped, too damaged, too compromised, too symbolic of a strange, brief chapter in the air war. But among veterans of the 8th Air Force, the memory endured. Men who had flown through flak and fighters could still recall the moment they realized that even a friendly shape could hide an enemy. "We used to look twice at every plane in formation after that," one recalled decades later. "Didn't matter if it had stars on the wings." You never knew. What began as a technical curiosity, a captured bomber tested in secrecy, had become a psychological weapon that blurred the lines between recognition and deception, between friend and foe. The Luftwaffe's attempt to turn the symbol of American power against its creators ultimately failed, but the illusion it created lingered long after the real aircraft were gone. In a war defined by numbers and machinery, it served as a reminder of something deeper, that technology could imitate strength, but never replace it. The B-17s flown under black crosses were ghosts of an empire already dying, their existence both a tribute to German ingenuity and a testament to its futility. They proved that even mastery of the enemy's tools could not alter the outcome once industry, manpower, and willpower had tipped the scales. For the men who had seen them at altitude, those fleeting, impossible glimpses of familiar wings turned alien. The memory never faded. A fortress with black crosses, a symbol of imitation that only underscored the truth the Germans had already admitted in secret. They had never built anything like it.